The wind came down the pass like a long-held breath, finally let go cold enough to bite the knuckles and set the teeth against each other. Elias Rowan stood by the iron stove with one hand braced on its rim palm, hot back cold as if his body could not agree which season it was. Outside, the pines leaned and whispered. The roof shook once, then settled. He listened to the familiar sounds of his own, making the ones that kept a man sane when no other voices would. The hiss of sap inside a burning log, the soft choke of smoke curling up the flue, the quiet tick of a tin cup cooling on the table. He had not heard a strange step in 3 winters and did not expect to again. He had just pinched the wick of the lantern lower when the first sound came. Not a knock, not a shout. A single thin cry that did not belong to any coyote. The kind of note that reaches past the ears and finds where a man keeps his oldest memories. He did not move right away. He set the lantern down, straightened his shoulders, and reached for the rifle that lived on 2 iron nails by the door. The stock was smooth from 1,000 unneeded liftings. The barrel swung gentle as he pushed the bolt with 2 fingers. He did not like the noise it made, but he liked not being ready even less. The second sound followed closer, urgent and ragged. A voice small and spent trying to be louder than it was. Help, the voice said, or something like it. Words were smaller in the wind. Elias stood with his back to the logs for a breath. Then he set the rifle against the wall not far from his hand and slid the bar free. The door grumbled open on swollen wood. She was on the steps bent to shield something he could not see. Her hair was shot with ice stuck in strands to her cheeks. Her dress hung in tatters at the hem and clung to her like a second skin half frozen. Her boots were tied with mismatched leather strips, and one foot left a smear of red on the top plank. Her arms were wrapped around a bundle held tight to her chest. The bundle made a sound like a bird trying to learn how to sing. For a breath, they only looked at each other. Her eyes were brown with dark around the rims like a doe that had run too far. There was no plea in them, and no anger either, just the blunt fact of being here. The wind took that moment to shove hard, and she swayed. Elias stepped to one side and left the path to the stove open. "Come in," he said, and the words felt unused. She crossed the threshold without thanks, not from rudeness, but because there was no space in her for extras. He swung the door with his foot and dropped the bar. The room shrank a little with the door shut, as it always did, and the smell of wet wool pine smoke and iron filled in around them. She did not stop until she was near the stove. When the heat touched her, she made a sound under her breath. Not pain, not relief, more like a worn hinge moving for the first time in seasons. He took the faded quilt from the chair and held it out. She shifted the bundle just enough for him to drape it over her shoulders. The cloth swallowed her, then slid down to cover the small face tucked under her chin. The face was pale and damp eyes closed, mouth open as if searching for air that did not hurt to breathe. The child was not newborn, not yet a talker either. The age in between all soft bones and fierce lungs, except these lungs were working like a bellows that had been left out in the rain. "Sit," Elias said, and he pulled the second chair forward, the one he had not used since he had decided he would not need two. She did not sit. She crouched by the stove as if chairs were for people whose lives had not been carried in their arms for days. He poured water into the kettle, not because tea would fix anything, but because the sound of water heating is one of the few sounds that tells the heart to slow down. He took the rifle back into his hand and set it across his knees, plus an old habit he could not put down. She noticed. Her gaze flicked from the metal to his face, measuring. He set the rifle against the wall again, a little farther from reach. He watched her watch him do it. The measure changed a notch. The child coughed, a small bark that scraped its way out. Elias moved one step, then stopped himself the way a man does when he remembers the rules he made for his own survival. She did not ask him to come closer. She pulled the quilt to make a tent over the small head, cupped the nape, and rubbed in slow circles. A tiny palm pushed up against her throat, then relaxed. "How far?" he said. She did not answer. He tried again. "How far have you come?" She lifted her head a little as if measuring him against the question. She blinked slow. "The past," she said. Her voice was rough, a thread rubbed thin. 2 days, maybe 3. "On foot," he said, though he already knew. "On what else?" she said, and her mouth twitched like the ghost of a smile had tried to be born there and failed. He set the kettle closer to the flame. The metal cried a little as it heated. He reached up to the high shelf and pulled down a clean shirt that was not new, only washed and folded and put away, waiting for a day he could not name. He set it on the table within her sight, but not within his offer. He could see she had learned what kind of help could come with a price she would not pay again. She looked at the shirt, then back at the small face, then back at the stove. He cut slices from the hard loaf and set them next to the stove to warm. He took the jar of honey he kept for winter coughs and set it near the bread. He did all this without saying what he was doing, because naming things felt like making them fragile. When the kettle began to murmur, he poured the water over a pinch of willow and a pinch of mint. The steam rose clean and sharp. "Take this," he said, and he held the tin cup in both hands, not passing it too close. She reached, careful not to shift the child too much. Her fingers were cracked along the knuckles, white lines that would split if asked for more. She sipped and shut her eyes for a single heartbeat, and he looked away because some moments should have privacy, even in a room with two strangers and a hungry fire. His own daughter had liked honey on bread when her cough let her swallow. The thought arrived uninvited, and he did not shove it out. It sat on the chair where he had put the quilt and watched him breathe. The old habit of running from it had lost its strength in the last year. Grief wears itself down on the edges of a man until both are smoother or both are gone. He was not sure which one he was becoming yet. The child roused and made a small broken sound that was less a cry than a question. The woman adjusted her hold and looked at Elias like a person asked for a tool without naming it. He moved slow, palms open, and took the bread and honey. He tore a corner small enough for a mouth just learning work and dipped it in the sweetness. He held it up. The child turned away from him and toward her, and then toward the bread when she brought it to those small lips. The first taste landed, the second, the third. The child coughed again, then settled into the work of living. "Thank you," she said, not soft or grateful, just factual, like the sound a stream makes when it crosses stones that have been there forever. Elias nodded as if a bargain had been kept. He did not ask her name. He had learned that names are like doors. Some are meant to stay shut until the frame has warmed. The wind pressed its shoulder against the cabin again, and the logs creaked and gave a little. A man who lives alone comes to know what each noise means. This one meant the storm wanted in, but not with spite, only with the dumb insistence of weather. He added another split log and watched the flame lift and take. The room grew a measure brighter. There was blood on her boot again. He noticed it because the floor below it made a small dark that would not dry right if ignored. He fetched the basin and set it near the stove and carried in a pot of snow and let it melt where the heat could reach it. His hands did the work while his mind watched the door, the window, the way the shadows shifted toward night. He passed her a cloth. She did not flinch when he set it on the floor by her heel. She unknotted the leather strips with fingers that had changed 100 small tasks into survival. The boot came off with a sound he did not like. The sock was worse. The skin beneath was raw where leather had rubbed it, and blisters had broken and frozen and broken again. He looked at her then and said what he knew would need saying for both their sakes. "You can stay through the weather. That is all the promise I can make." Her gaze held his for a moment that was not long and not short. "I did not come for promises," she said. "I came because the baby could not walk any farther." "The baby," he said. He let the word sit. The child was small ribs like the curved slats of a basket, a boy by the look of the small jaw. He thought of asking a father name and did not. He thought of offering the cot in the back room and did not. He thought of how a man becomes part of a story, whether he asks to or not, the moment he opens a door in a storm. Night sank its weight on the cabin. The lamp threw a low circle. The stove ticked in small contentment. Elias watched the woman bind her foot with his clean cloth and watched the child sleep without the shallow pull of panic. He did not know them, and yet some part of him had begun to count their breaths. He sat back in the chair that had not been used much and let it move once. The sound it made was not the ghost he feared. It was wood remembering it was meant to carry living weight. Outside, the past kept its own counsel. Inside, 3 lives shared air that was warmer than it had been an hour ago. Elias rested his palm on the table and felt the grain, the small grooves he had carved in it with a knife one winter, when the days were too short for chores and too long for silence. He looked at the door as if it might speak. It did not. He looked at the woman as if she might leave. She did not. He looked at the child as if there were an answer there. The child slept. The wind shifted, the stove sighed. Somewhere deep in the timber, a branch let go and fell into snow. Elias drew a breath that went all the way down and did not splinter. For the first time in a season, he did not dread the hours between midnight and dawn. He would watch the fire. He would keep it fed. He would count the breaths he did not own but could protect. When he finally closed his eyes, it was not to escape. It was to hold the shape of this room exactly as it was, and say to himself without speaking that he would open the door again when the next sound came, whatever it was. The morning did not come with light, but with a thinning of dark, the kind that turns the window glass from black to gray before any warmth arrives. Elias had not slept, though his eyes had closed more than once. He listened through the night to the rhythm of two other beings in his cabin, a sound he had not known for years. The child stirred once or twice soft mewls that the woman answered with murmured tones. Elias never caught the words. They were shaped from a tongue not his own, something old, maybe older than these mountains. When he rose, he did not announce it. He moved to the door, slid the bar, and stepped outside. Frost cracked under his boots. His breath lifted into the frozen air, a slow column that broke when the wind found it. He gathered wood, first stacking it under one arm, then went to the shed to check the traps. Two rabbits waited stiff with cold eyes glazed in moonlight, not yet gone. He whispered a word no one could hear, a habit from boyhood, an acknowledgement that life taken should not be nameless. He carried them inside, hanging them by the stove so the ice would loosen. She was awake when he entered, her back-straight eyes on the child quilt wrapped across her shoulders. Her gaze flicked once to the rabbits, then down again. The baby shifted, pressed a small hand to her collarbone, and sighed. She adjusted her hold without thought, the kind of movement that belonged to mothers everywhere, whether or not they named themselves so. "I will stew one," Elias said, his voice low from disuse. She nodded, nothing more. He cleaned the rabbit over the basin, set the meat into a pot with water, and cut what root vegetables he had left. Her eyes followed the knife in his hands, not with fear but with calculation, as if she weighed each slice against her memory of knives used for harm. She spoke at last. "His name is Daniel." Her voice was steadier now, though still rough at the edges. The words seemed to hang between them, fragile as frost on a thin branch. Elias paused, knife midair. He looked at the boy, small chest rising under the quilt. "Daniel," he said, and the sound of it filled the cabin in a way he had not expected. She gave no name for herself. He did not ask. As the stew simmered, Elias pulled out the cradle from the back corner where it had been pushed against the wall, covered by tools and dust. His hands hesitated on it. Once he had sworn not to touch it again, but silence had a way of changing oaths. He set it near the stove, brushed sawdust from its sides, and tightened the loosened peg at the base. She watched, lips parting slightly, as if she recognized something of her own in that small act of repair. Daniel whimpered, and she placed him carefully in the cradle. The wood creaked, then settled. His hands, tiny fists, opened and closed against the blanket. Elias saw his daughter again in that gesture and forced his breath steady. The woman leaned back against the chair and closed her eyes for a moment, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Elias ladled stew into a tin bowl, set it on the table, and pushed it toward her. "Eat," he said. She obeyed without a word, spoon, slow but steady. Every few mouthfuls she glanced at Daniel as if to confirm the world had not stolen him away while she swallowed. "You came over the pass," Elias said after a long silence. She nodded, chewing, eyes lowered. "No horse?" Another nod. "Men?" he asked. Her hand froze midair, spoon hovering. Then she lowered it gently to the bowl. "3. Her voice was flat, emptied of detail. "Did they follow?" "Not yet." The fire snapped. A log collapsed into embers. Elias stared into it, jaw tight. He knew the kind of men who left a woman barefoot in snow. He knew what they called her. He also knew they might still be behind her, one ridge or two away. When she had eaten all she could, she set the bowl aside and pulled the quilt tighter. Elias reached into a crate, brought out strips of dried venison, and wrapped them in cloth. "For the road," he said. She looked at him sharply, eyes narrowing. "You mean for me to leave?" His hand stayed busy with the cloth. "Storm breaks soon. Safer to move then." "Safer," she repeated as if tasting the word. "Safer for who?" He met her gaze. "For Daniel." Her lips pressed tight, but she did not argue. She turned her face to the cradle instead. Daniel had fallen asleep, cheek against the quilt, small breath fogging the wood rail. Her fingers brushed his hair, once trembling. The rest of the day passed in silence, broken only by chores. She swept the floor with a care that surprised him. When the child stirred, she hummed again in that language of hers, and the sound reached places in Elias that had gone unused too long. He mended a latch, sharpened his knife, and forced himself not to stare. As night fell, he laid another log on the fire. She stood near the cradle, eyes on the flames. Without looking at him, she said quietly, "They will come when the snow lifts." Elias tightened the strap on his rifle and gave no reply. The wind outside had eased, but inside the cabin another storm was gathering. One made not of weather, but of past deeds following close behind. And in the stillness that stretched between them, Elias knew the next choice would decide whether this cabin became a refuge or a grave. The next morning arrived sharp and brittle, the kind that made the cabin walls groan like tired bones. Frost clung to the inside edges of the window panes, spreading in lace patterns that seemed too delicate for a place built of rough logs and iron nails. Elias was already awake, splitting wood at the stump outside each swing of the axe, steady and deliberate, his breath rising in clouds that hung until the wind stole them. Inside she stirred. The quilt slipped from her shoulders as she reached for Daniel, who was still curled in the cradle. The boy blinked, eyes glassy but alive, and his lips moved around the soft sound of hunger. She unwrapped him with practiced hands, shifting him close to her chest beneath the shawl. Her movements were automatic, but her face betrayed the weight of sleepless nights and years of running. When Elias stepped back into the cabin, arms filled with fresh wood, the warmth of the stove met him first. Then her eyes. She looked away quickly, focusing on the child as if afraid of what it meant to be seen too long. He set the wood down without speaking, dusted snow from his shoulders, and crossed to the kettle. "The boy needs more than heat," Elias said. His voice was flat, not unkind, but the words carried the edge of worry. She nodded, silent. From a pouch tied to her waist, she pulled a small bundle of dried herbs. Crushed leaves fell into her palm, and she mixed them with warm water in a tin cup. She held it to Daniel's lips, coaxing him with soft whispers. Elias watched from the table, hands busy repairing a strap, but his gaze kept drifting toward the boy. "Where did you learn that?" he asked finally. She glanced up, cautious, as though his question were a test. "From my mother," she said. Her voice was low, almost reverent. She knew what plants would keep us alive when there was nothing else. He nodded once, filing that truth away. Daniel drank slowly, small gulps that seemed too fragile for the world around him. When he finished, she wiped his mouth with the corner of her sleeve and pressed a kiss against his temple. The tenderness of it caught Elias off guard. For a moment, the image of his own daughter flashed before him. Dark curls, fevered skin, a hand that grew cold too fast. He tightened his grip on the strap leather, biting into his palms, forcing the memory back into the shadows where it belonged. The day passed in quiet tasks. Elias repaired the broken latch on the window, checked the traps again, and salted the rabbit meat for later. She mended torn seams on her dress with the careful precision of someone who had done the same work in dim light too many times to count. As dust settled, snow began to fall again. Soft at first, then thicker, blotting out the ridgelines in the distance. Elias stood at the door, eyes scanning the white blur beyond the clearing. His hand lingered near the rifle propped against the wall. "They will come," she said from behind him. Not as a question, but as a certainty. He did not turn. "Yes." Her breath caught sharp, and for the first time she allowed her fear to show. "What will you do?" Elias shifted the wood under his boots, creaking. "Whatever I must." Silence stretched heavy until Daniel's small cough broke it. She crossed the room, lifted the boy, and held him close. When she looked at Elias again, her eyes were no longer just fearful. They carried something harder, a glint of defiance born from years of being treated as less than human. "I will not let them take him," she said, voice steady. Elias studied her, weighing her words, the set of her jaw, the grip of her hands around the child. For the first time since she had stumbled into his cabin, he saw not just a woman on the run, but a mother ready to fight with everything she had left. "Then we stand together," he said. The fire snapped, loud sparks leaping up the flue, as if the cabin itself had heard and agreed. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the old tracks, erasing the past that had led them here. But Elias knew new tracks would come soon enough, and when they did, there would be no hiding from the storm that followed. Night wrapped the cabin in a muffled hush, the kind of quiet that pressed against the skin until every heartbeat felt louder than the wind outside. Elias sat in the rocking chair, the rifle balanced across his knees, his eyes on the dying fire. Each ember pulsed like a slow breath. Across from him, the woman lay curled on the floor with Daniel tucked to her chest, the quilt drawn tight around them. Her lashes trembled, but her eyes did not open. She was half asleep, half listening. Elias could tell. A person who has run this long never truly rests. He leaned forward, added another log, and watched the flames catch. His hands remembered the weight of small fingers that once tugged at his beard, the way a child's laughter filled the gaps in silence. The ache of memory was sharp enough to make him close his eyes, but he didn't. Not tonight. A sound came then, faint but deliberate, from the tree line beyond the clearing. Not the shuffle of snow falling from branches, not the cry of a night bird. Heavier, measured. Elias stiffened, rising slow, rifle in hand. He moved to the window, peering through frost-laced glass. Moonlight broke enough of the storm to reveal what he feared: tracks in the snow, half-covered, circling. His jaw tightened. Wolves, maybe. Men, more likely. He lowered the bar across the door, double-checked the shutters, and returned to the chair. The rocking creaked once, then stilled. The woman stirred, eyes opening in the dim glow. "What is it?" she whispered. He didn't lie. Tracks, close. Her grip on Daniel tightened, and knuckles pale. She said nothing more, only drew the quilt higher, eyes fixed on the cradle as if it were both shield and target. Hours passed like that, watching, waiting, listening to every groan of the logs, every rush of wind. When dawn finally bled gray through the cracks in the shutters, Elias pushed to his feet and stepped outside. The cold struck like a hammer. Snow came up to his knees, but the tracks were still there, fresh enough to sting his gut. Men, not wolves. 4, maybe 5. They had circled the cabin, tested the distance, then moved off down the ridge. He came back in stamped snow from his boots. She was standing now, shawl around her shoulders, hair loose from its braid. Her eyes searched his face, reading the answer before he spoke. "They know we're here," he said. She nodded once, no flinch, no collapse. Instead, she crossed to the table, set Daniel down on the quilt, and began to braid her hair again with steady fingers. The gesture was small, ordinary, but it carried weight. It meant she had decided to face what came, not flee. "You could leave," Elias said, surprising even himself. "When the storm breaks, I can give you food, a direction." Her hands paused in the braid. "Leave," she repeated, then shook her head. "No. They will follow. They will follow until I stop running." The words cut clean, and Elias knew she was right. Some debts of flesh and control were never meant to be forgiven by those who claim them. "Then we'll meet them here," he said. The fire spat, casting sparks like stars across the black iron belly of the stove. Daniel stirred a small whimper, then settled again. The woman's braid fell over her shoulder, rough but sure, and she tied it with a strip of cloth. Her gaze lifted to Elias, steady now. "Tell me what I must do," she said. Elias studied her, the scars hidden beneath sleeves, the shadows in her eyes, the way her arms curved protectively around the child. And for the first time since the door had opened on that storm-racked night, he felt something shift inside him. Not pity, not burden. Something closer to respect, the kind a man gives another soul who has survived what should have killed them. "We prepare," he answered. And in the cabin that had once held only silence, 2 people began to ready themselves for the storm that was no longer made of snow. The day unfolded in fragments, each hour bent toward the same truth: they would not be left alone. Elias set about with quiet purpose, moving as though he had rehearsed this moment his whole life. He checked the rifle twice, oiled the bolt-cut strips of cloth for wadding. He set snares at the edge of the clearing, not for game this time, but to slow the steps of men. The woman watched, at first silent, Daniel balanced on her hip. But when Elias began stacking wood in a low barricade against the north wall, she stepped forward. "Show me," she said. He studied her for a breath, searching for hesitation. There was none. So he placed the axe in her hands. It dwarfed her at first, the handle longer than her arm, but she adjusted, braced her foot, and brought it down. The log split clean. She did not smile, did not flinch at the weight. She simply set another log and struck again. Daniel fussed, and she shifted, rocking him gently between swings. Elias watched the sight, strange and steadying all at once. Survival was not a thing of brute strength alone. It was rhythm, persistence, knowing when to hold and when to let go. In her, he saw both. When dusk neared, the sky bruised purple behind the pines, Elias showed her how to load the pistol he kept hidden beneath the cot. Her fingers trembled the first time, not from fear of the weapon, but from what it meant. She steadied by the second try, and by the third the click of the chamber was sure. They ate little that night, only stew stretched thin with water. Daniel drank from the cup she had prepared, eyelids, heavy cheeks warmer than they had been in days. When she laid him in the cradle, she lingered with her hand on his chest until the rise and fall steadied. Then she sat across from Elias at the table. The fire was low shadows climbing the walls. Her eyes held his for longer than before. "You lost someone," she said softly. The words struck like a blade eased between old ribs. Elias looked down his thumb, tracing the groove of a knot in the wood. "My daughter," he said at last. His voice was rough stone broken by years of disuse. "Fever took her. Too quick. I was not here when it mattered." Silence followed, thick, but not empty. She reached across the table, hesitated, then let her hand rest near his, not touching close enough. "I buried a brother in the same storm that brought me here," she said. Her eyes flickered with memory, but her voice held. "He tried to shield me when the men came. They cut him down and called it law." Elias's jaw clenched. He did not ask for more. Some truths weighed enough without detail. The wind outside rose, rattling the shutters, pushing snow against the cabin. Inside, the two of them sat in a silence that was no longer wary but shared. The firelight painted her face in soft gold, and for the first time he noticed the faint curve of resilience there. Not beauty in the shallow sense, but strength carved by survival. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a note like steel beneath cloth. "If they come tomorrow, we end it. No more running." Elias nodded, agreed. The logs shifted in the stove sparks, flaring and dying. Daniel stirred once in his sleep, a small sound, then quiet. The woman leaned back, braid falling over her shoulder, and closed her eyes. Elias remained at the table, watching the door, listening to the storm gather its voice. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, whether by teeth, by steel, or by fire. And for the first time in many years, he did not face it alone. The storm did not ease with dawn. It hardened, pressing down on the mountains, as though the sky itself meant to bury all beneath it. Snow hammered the roof, rattled against the shutters, piled high against the door. Yet beneath the fury of weather, Elias heard it, a rhythm that did not belong. Hooves. Muffled but there. Steady circling. He stood from the table, rifle already in hand. The woman was by the cradle shawl, wrapped close, eyes sharp. Daniel stirred as if he too sensed the weight in the air. "They've come," Elias said. She did not ask how many. She only lifted Daniel into her arms, pressing him close beneath the quilt. Her lips brushed his hair, once quick like a blessing, too fragile to be spoken aloud. Then she turned, gaze fixed on the door. Elias moved with practiced steps, checking the shutters, the cracks in the logs, the traps he had laid. The world outside was a blur of white and shadow, but through the veil of snow he caught movement, figures dismounting, dark shapes against the pale. 4, maybe 5. One stayed mounted, watching. The knock came not frantic like hers had been, but slow, deliberate. The kind of sound men make when they already believe the door belongs to them. "Open up," a voice called, muffled by storm, but clear enough. "We know she's in there." The woman's arms tightened around Daniel. Elias met her gaze. She shook her head, once firm. Another knock, harder. The wood quivered. Elias raised the rifle, voice low but steady. "You'll not find what you're looking for here." A laugh followed, harsh and cruel. "Old man, you can't keep what ain't yours." His finger brushed the trigger, but he did not fire, not yet. The storm could cover many things, but it would not bury murder so quickly. He waited, heart-steady eyes on the gap between shutter and frame. One of the men stepped closer, boot crunching in the snow. "You hand her over and maybe we leave you standing." The woman's voice cut the silence sharp as a blade. "I am not theirs, not now, not ever." The words struck like iron in the quiet. Even the storm seemed to pause. Elias's jaw tightened. "You heard her?" he said. "She's not yours." A curse spat back, followed by the scrape of boots on the porch. The latch shook once, twice, then a shoulder slammed hard against the wood. The bar held, but the door shuddered. Daniel whimpered, small and frightened, but the woman rocked him, humming under her breath in that language again, soft and defiant. When the third blow came, Elias fired. The shot split the storm, deafening in the cabin. Outside, a cry rang out, followed by the thud of a body into snow. The others shouted, voices tangled with wind. Elias reloaded, fast, eyes never leaving the door. His chest was tight, not with fear, but with certainty. They would either fall back or force the fight. The woman laid Daniel in the cradle, her hands steady even as her face blanched. She picked up the pistol Elias had given her, checked the chamber, and moved to the window. Her braid brushed her shoulder as she pressed against the wall. Eyes set ready. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, two hearts beat with the same resolve this cabin would not fall easy. Not to wolves, not to men, not today. The storm did half the fighting for them. Snow blinded the men outside, turned their shouts into echoes, their movements into shadows. Elias held his rifle steady at the door, each breath measured. Beside him, the woman braced at the window-slit pistol, clutched firm though her hand trembled. Daniel's soft cries rose and fell from the cradle. Not loud, but enough to remind them both why they stood where they did. A figure lurched into view, rushing the porch. Elias fired once, cleaned the sound, splitting the storm. The man collapsed into the drift, his body swallowed almost instantly by snow. Another voice cursed, shouted for retreat, but a third pressed forward, too desperate or too proud to listen. He struck the shutter with his shoulder, rattling the boards. The woman lifted the pistol, eyes wide, and fired. The shot went wild, but close enough to send the man stumbling back. Smoke filled the cabin, bitter and sharp, but neither moved from their posts. Elias reloaded, jaw-clenched, eyes burning from powder. Then came silence. No voices, no boots on snow, only the wind keening through the pass. He waited, every muscle taut. The woman lowered the pistol but kept it ready, her chest heaving, braid clinging damp to her cheek. A long moment stretched. Then hoofbeats, slow fading, swallowed by distance. "They're leaving," she whispered. "For now," Elias said. He barred the door again, set the rifle aside, and finally let his shoulders sag. The woman moved to the cradle, lifting Daniel, pressing him against her chest, as if to confirm he was still whole. Her lips brushed his hair, whispering words too soft for Elias to hear. The cabin smelled of gunpowder, wet wool, and fear burned off into resolve. Elias sat heavy in the chair, the rocking creaking once. His hands shook, not from weakness, but from the release of what had been held too tight. She turned, eyes meeting his across the dim room. "Thank you," she said. "Not as a debt, not as surrender, but as a fact." He nodded once. We held. Her gaze lingered, and for the first time since that night, she stumbled barefoot into his cabin. Her face softened. Not just exhaustion, not just survival, something else. Trust, tentative, but real. Outside, the storm began to ease, flakes falling slower, the sky lightening with the promise of dawn. The land would remember the blood spilled in its snow. But inside the cabin, another memory was being written. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes on the fire. "You don't have to go," he said quietly, almost to himself. She looked down at Daniel, his tiny fist curled against her collarbone, then back at Elias. Her answer did not come in words. She crossed the room, laid the baby in the cradle, and sat on the floor beside the fire. Close enough that the warmth touched them both, close enough that the silence between them was no longer empty. And as dawn broke at last over the mountains, the cabin stood not as a refuge of one man, but as a place claimed by 3 lives bound together by storm blood and the choice to endure.